Hi, I'm Matt Regier, and I'm going to help you get familiar with FERPA here at USD 206 Whitewater Remington. What is FERPA? FERPA is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. It's centered around the rights of parents and adult-age students in a public school like ours, 18 or over, and their ability to inspect and receive student records, deny access to others as necessary, correct correct errors, including a hearing if necessary, opt out of military recruitment, opt out of disclosure of student directory information, and if necessary, to file a complaint with the U.S. Department of Education. Um, Besides the specifics, this is centered around parents and adult age students having control over their data and who gets their hands on it. Who's subject to FERPA? We are, obviously, or I wouldn't be making this video, but it applies to all schools that receive federal funding for any program. So all public elementary and secondary schools, all public colleges and universities, and many private schools or colleges and universities that receive federal funding for some of their programs. The data protected by FERPA is pretty wide-ranging. It includes educational records, which are directly related to the student. It's any records that are maintained by the educational institution or that are maintained by a third-party agent acting on their behalf. So if the educational institution transfers data to a third party, that still counts as an educational record because it originated with the school. And none of that data may be shared without consent. It also includes directory information, which generally is not necessarily harmful or invasive if it's disclosed. And it might include things like the student's name, address, photograph, date of birth, grade level, activities that they participated or lettered in. There's a wide variety of directory information. And this may be shared with third parties without consent as long as parents have received notice of the information that will be disclosed and had an opportunity to restrict that. There are some further restrictions here if it's personally identifiable information. If the combination of information would allow a reasonable observer to identify the student, then that's subject to more strict regulation. So what data is unprotected? That seems like a lot. There are a few things that are unprotected by FERPA. Teachers' notes are one of them. So a teacher who creates notes solely for their own use, that would not be protected by FERPA. Law enforcement or security records maintained solely for law enforcement purposes. So if it stays in the hands of the law enforcement and is not shared with the school, that would not be protected by FERPA because it's not school or educational record. Employment records and alumni records are also not protected by FERPA. Some exceptions to FERPA, and these from the resources were widely misconceived. Threat assessment teams are an exception to FERPA. So in an emergency such as an epidemic, a school shooting, something that's concerning about the safety of students or staff, the information that is necessary to safeguard students and or staff may be shared without consent. That is a student safety or a staff safety piece of information, and that may be shared without consent. It may be shared with appropriate parties, those that have a legitimate interest and purpose for the threat assessment, who will help protect the health and safety of the school community. Those disclosures do need to be recorded, but the Department of Education and the courts have consistently sided with schools in threat assessment scenarios as long as the threat was legitimate and as long as the disclosure was recorded. There's also an exception with international students. The Department of Homeland Security does have access to student records to monitor stays of international students on certain visas. Now, this doesn't mean that Immigration and Customs Enforcement can access all educational records. That's not what this exception is. It's for monitoring the stays of international students on visas so that, say, a foreign exchange student doesn't overstay their visa. FERPA and vendors. This is one of the most significant pieces currently as we move consistently towards a more and more digital school setup. Vendors are expected to protect data in a similar manner to schools. So all of the FERPA rights and FERPA regulations that schools are held to are also need to be upheld by a third-party vendor. So if students are using a third-party vendor online, if they're using an app, they're playing a game, they're using a piece of software, all of those vendors need to protect the student data in a similar manner to how the school would. Schools are ultimately held responsible for that student data and for how the third-party vendor uses it. So it's important that schools be careful with a free app or service because free may mean that data mining and data sharing is one of the ways that that app or service gets profits. And since the data ultimately belongs to the school, school officials and teachers need to be careful about where they're sharing that data to make sure that the vendors are complying with the requirements of FERPA. Surveillance is another interesting case that has a little bit of gray area. Surveillance video is considered an educational record if it is used for disciplinary purposes, if it's focused on a particular student, if it shows that student involved in potential disciplinary action, involved in a law infraction, if it's focused on that student for some purpose or another. If it shows a student during an injury or during an emergency, again, it's focused on a particular student. Or if it contains personally identifiable information. From that directory information we spoke of earlier, if it's personally identifiable, then it's an educational record and it can't be shared. A recording is not a part of educational record if it includes a student in an incidental role to the activity. So if there's a recording of a student that needs to be shared and another student happens to be in the video, that would be an incidental role to the activity. It's also not part of the educational record if it's recorded and maintained by law enforcement. So again, video that is recorded by law enforcement and kept by law enforcement is not part of that educational record. Another exception here that would kind of go with the incidental role includes someone that maybe is playing in a basketball game. The recording is of the basketball game. The student happens to be incidental there. That would not be a part of the educational record. So how do you stay FERPA compliant? And that's important for a school district and for a school board and for employees to understand. The most important thing, or the first step at least, is to know and communicate the rules. And this probably needs to consist of some sort of annual training for staff, for administrators that are going to deal with student data about the rules of FERPA and what it requires of staff members. How do we keep student data safe? How do we keep from oversharing with each other or with third-party vendors? It's important that as a district we're choosing compliant vendors and that we have a process to vet those vendors to make sure that they are doing with student data what they should be doing. And we also need to devise and implement compliance procedures within our district to destroy old or unnecessary data, to avoid emailing private information, especially if it's unencrypted, and to encrypt those files and emails that even might have some sort of student data included. Destroying data, that was referenced in the previous slide. Destroying data now is much more difficult than it was, say, 20 years ago. If it was a traditional paper record, you could shred it or you could burn it and the data was gone. Digital data is much more difficult to destroy. Deletion is typically insufficient. Just because something is deleted off of a hard drive doesn't mean that it's gone. It just means that it doesn't show up when you open up the file. So there need to be some more stringent steps taken to actually destroy that data. FERPA doesn't provide any technical guidance on how to do so, but it probably is necessary. So data needs to be managed effectively throughout its lifetime to prepare for that eventual disposal so that it's not in too many places. And then we also need to track our third-party vendors to make sure that they are destroying their data, either when the contract ends or it's no longer needed for its original purpose. And those restrictions would hold for the school as well. When the student leaves or it's no longer needed for the original purpose, some data is best to be destroyed. That destruction process is constantly evolving based on how data is stored and what technology we have to destroy it. But it should be more complete based on the sensitivity of the data. For really sensitive data, such as a social security number, that needs to be destroyed. For relatively inconsequential data, perhaps deletion or more of a clearing or reset would be sufficient. So violations. There are going to be violations that happen, hopefully not within our district, but they do occur. So in the case of a violation, there's several methods that can be employed as necessary for the U.S. Department of Education, and it's an efficiency issue. They want to take care of these cases as efficiently as possible. So the first case, and probably the most frequent case, is to act as an intermediary to resolve disputes over educational records amendments. A parent or a student has a concern and wants to amend their record, so the USDE would act as an intermediary to resolve that dispute. A second option would be to work with an offending school that has actually had an accidental or maybe intentional disclosure of data or overexposure of data, to resolve those disclosures and then to improve their policy and procedure to make it so that that doesn't happen again. And then when necessary, a full formal investigation would take place. That's obviously a much more time-consuming step, and that's why they have those other two options to be a little bit more efficient, especially since students in school don't last forever, and you would want many cases to be resolved before the student is entirely out of school or before maybe that educational record has had an impact on a student's future. So what does our board policy say? We do have a notice of FERPA rights, which is good. We have a notice of authorized student data disclosures. So we're notifying parents, notifying students that that directory information may and will be shared with some third-party vendors, and that they have a right to restrict that. We have a timeline for data destruction. So when the data is no longer useful, it will be destroyed. So all of the board policy pieces are in place to notify parents, notify students of their rights and our responsibilities in the parts of the bargain that we will uphold. The piece that I think we could consider and probably audit just a little bit in-house are compliance. Are we really secure with our student data? And are our employees aware of FERPA and its requirements? Are we encrypting emails? Are we sharing data outside of our school that probably should not be shared? Are we consistent and secure with the vendors that we're using? Are our vendors secure with our student data? So our policy is good. The compliance piece and whether we're holding up our end of the bargain is the piece that maybe needs to be considered a little bit more. That might be as simple as an annual training. It might be a little more in-depth look with a longitudinal study within our district to make sure that we're following the rules and that we're complying with FERPA. Overall, our policy is good. We just need to make sure that we're actually following the things that we say we're going to do. References for my slideshow are here. Thank you for listening, and I hope we can do our best to stay compliant and follow the rules of FERPA.